Okay, our last but not least speaker is Brendan, who's an MD PhD candidate at Yale School of Medicine. Brendan has experience as a startup founder, as the supervisor of a mobile health clinic that served migrant farm worker communities in the Midwest United States, and as an advisor to a nonprofit focused on health and education access in cocoa farming communities in rural Ghana. Okay.
Seems like the remote is still down. I can use this though. Okay.
You put it down here, like there.
Okay, everybody. I'm going to be talking about multi-geographical neuroimaging. And just to mention quickly, this is based off a perspective piece I'm writing. If you'd like to take a look, access it there. And then also, if you have an interest in collaborating as it relates to rural populations, I'd be happy to chat. Well, let's start with this question. When you think of geographic diversity, what comes to mind? I think at OHBM, we probably think of the inclusion of international data sets typically. But what I want to focus on today is variation within individual countries and really how we tend to overlook rural populations. And if you didn't know where you are, here's where you are in Brisbane. There's a world map kind of showing population density, and as you can see, Australia is majority rural area by landmass. In my examples today, I'll be talking about the United States because that's where I'm from, but hopefully a little bit is interesting to you and you can take it home wherever you might be from. And why am I particularly interested in this? I grew up in rural Ohio in the United States, still spent a lot of time there, and this is my backyard. So you can see the butting up against the tractor there. And are you ready for the big reveal of the front yard? We have more of the same in the front yard. And then I also have a F30 grant that's focused on kind of bias in brain behavior predictive models, or how they might perform more poorly in rural populations. A little bit about rural health disparities, and this is talking about the United States. About 1/5 of the US population is rural, and 1 in 5 of those individuals suffers from mental illness. Those rates of mental illness are very similar in urban populations. However, rural populations have a disproportionate burden of negative mental health outcomes. For example, suicide rates are higher in rural areas, about 45% more than in larger metropolitan counties. And then really, there's so many health disparities, but I think this one kind of stands out and sums it up. Rural individuals are more likely to die prematurely from the top 5 leading causes of death. And that's a pretty striking statistic and really highlights why we need to make sure we're serving rural populations with neuroimaging. Rural underrepresentation in neuroimaging. I think this is probably not surprising to people, but we're not necessarily doing too much to address it as of yet. And really just due to logistical practicalities. Our data collection sites are largely in urban centers, just more populated areas. So it creates this situation where rural people aren't included, and they're severely underrepresented in our data sets. A case study, just to highlight this, that I'll talk about very briefly, the Adolescent Brain Cognitive Development Study. It's the largest long-term study of child brain health and development in the United States. I do want to preface that by saying the ABCD study is one of the only large-scale neuroimaging data sets that intentionally recruited rural participants. So huge props to them for that, for kind of being ahead of the curve. That being said, here's a map of the United States. We have the non-metropolitan counties in yellow and the metropolitan counties there are in white. Basically, you can think of here, yellow are less densely populated rural counties. So yellow is rural. And here are ABCD study sites. You can see they're everywhere except for the rural areas. And again, interesting because ABCD did have this goal of recruiting rural participants. As a result of this, here's the breakdown of the demographics of the ABCD study. For a given demographic, you can see their representation within the United States in the blue bars, and the orange bars are their representation within the ABCD data set. So ABCD really went to great lengths to try to include folks who were traditionally underrepresented in research. You can see they did a very good job with females and black participants, but then when it came to rural participants, had some struggles here. So again, about 20% of the population is rural, only about 9% of the ABCD study is rural. And it really does kind of highlight how these research infrastructures, recruitment pipelines, even despite very targeted outreach and well-intentioned efforts, it's very difficult. And this is a breakdown by study site, just another visualization. Let's see if I have my remote. Well, that part works. Okay, so if we see here, I gotta be able to do both at the same time though. Okay, I'll just do it this way. So you can see Utah, that's where we have about 1,000 participants who are from an urban area, but only 13 participants who are rural, even though Utah has a decent rural population. And then just to highlight another site, University of Vermont. This is where we have a lot of rural participants. And this is interesting because if you're studying ABCD in rural, or rural in ABCD, you're kind of studying Vermont. And that is a bit problematic because Vermont is not necessarily representative of rural. And it's not that Vermont isn't rural, it's actually the most rural by population share in the United States. But I like this kind of breakdown to show that there's differences in the top 5 most rural states in the United States in terms of their kind of socio-demographics. And let's see if I can do this. You can see here, maybe just stick with this Vermont example, about 90% of the population is white, whereas in Mississippi, you have a very prominent percent of the population identifies as black or African American. If you look at life expectancy, Vermont, 78, West Virginia, Mississippi, 71. Voting differences, those are very different in Vermont and elsewhere. But then also just to show your per capita funding from the National Institutes of Health, about triple goes to Vermont compared to West Virginia or Mississippi. And you can see how each of these things could maybe influence brain behavior relationships and why we want to capture that diversity within rural as well and not just kind of look at this monolith. There's actually a lot of heterogeneity that we could be capturing. And here's why it all matters. So rural experiences, they can shape our brain behavior relationships and maybe kind of brain function, dysfunction, development. Some of these are very obvious: social isolation, healthcare access, environmental exposures, agricultural exposures. You could think of access to green space, religious practices, many different things that could shape our brain that we aren't really investigating, or at least in terms of might not be capturing certain ends of the spectrums as it relates to rural versus urban populations. And then the issue is, when it comes time to kind of use our results or learn something about the brain, that these different influences, our results might not generalize across them, or they may fail to generalize across the unique environmental, sociocultural, kind of different aspects of rural living. And this is important, obviously now, as we're trying to understand the brain. Primarily, we're using MRI or other imaging modalities as a tool to learn, to understand, and kind of learn about the brain and its neurobiological insights. But then also in the future, and I think this is where I'm particularly interested in, is the kind of future goal in the perfect world, we're using these. As a patient walks in and we're using imaging in some way, that these type of clinical tools might not serve rural populations like they do urban populations. Okay, and then kind of looking forward a little bit, don't go into depth here, but we have a long way to go. I think right now with rural populations, it's probably just really at the measuring stage and kind of being aware of this, that if you have a data set, or especially large-scale data sets, what is the rural representation within that data set? Are you capturing these populations? And then looking forward more, including rural participants. It's not just extending your recruitment efforts. I think it really means probably building a lot of trust. Trust in science is at all-time lows. And there's kind of a catch-22 because really increasing representation would increase trust, but that's also hard without the trust. And so a lot of different ideas, but I think investing in rural communities and actually having research sites there would be one step. And then also kind of maybe a little more feasible in more resource-limited settings or situations, emerging technologies like mobile MRI, ways that we can include rural people so they don't have to drive hours and hours to participate in research. And that's all I have. Thank you.